So we're going to start this video here kind of picking up with some of these Yuan Dynasty painters who took up Zhao Mingfu's ideas. And the person we're really going to use is Ni Zan to think about this. Many later painters similarly looked to the painting style and his lifestyle that he created and used that as their model. It's really important for us to realize that it was indeed a way of life. It's not just a kind of painting style, but these painters are really interested in living, embodying the idealized, romanticized, intellectual artist who was too gifted for public service, kind of misunderstood by the government. Ni's work is similar to other literati work in that it's done entirely in ink. It's kind of monochromatic style, and it depicts a lake district, this lake region in Ni's home district. He uses what is called a dry brush technique in ink painting, where the brush is not fully loaded with ink and it lets the paper show, or what's called breathing, throughout the brush strokes. So you can see that dry brush technique here in the center, even down kind of in the foreground. The result is really a painting that has this sense of purity, the sense of a kind of light touch. And this spare, dry style really becomes associated with that noble Confucian spirit and the spirit of the literati. As we get into the Ming Dynasty, we're looking in the kind of the mid-14th century now. The Mongol Yuan Emperor and his government are overthrown in 1368. And then the Ming Dynasty is the restoration of a dynasty of ethnic Han Chinese. The founder of the Ming Dynasty came from poor, uneducated peasants. He rose through the ranks of the army in this kind of rags to riches story. And here we see he really calls the literati back. He needs these scholars to help him solidify his following. And this is not all literati. We're going to, though, see that continuing tension between court style and literati style. But let's start with Shenzhou's Poet on a Mountaintop. And this really continues the tradition of the Yuan literati. Shenzhou led a group of painters known as the Wu School, W-U, and it's a group of painters who were largely organized by the artistic theory of its members. They're not professional painters. They're literati scholars who are interested in that combination of poetry, painting, and calligraphy. And we see landscape figures similar to Shenzhou's here, where we have this tiny human figure dwarfed by the landscape. That's very typical of the Wu School. Similarly, we also have this combination of landscape and poetry, this kind of visual and the textual element. And I'm including here on the left a translation of the poem, and we see how it's almost like this kind of mini dwarfed figure standing on the cliff precipice is it's almost as if he's looking out into this expanse and gazing out at his own poem. And as you can see in the poem, we have this kind of this sense of kind of seeking, or this kind of trying to grasp the philosophical dimensions of nature. I think one comparison that's important to make here would be with the Italian Renaissance. They are roughly, here we're looking at around 1500. This is the same time that Michelangelo is painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Leonardo is painting the Last Supper in the monastery in Milan. And we see all of these noble patrons in Italy who want to display their commitment to the intellectual ideals of the Renaissance. And so they commission important Renaissance artists, in a way, artists who are much like the Chinese literati, um, to to commission have works done in their palace, similar here to the Camera Picta, the painted room in the Ducal Palace of Mantua, done by Mantegna. And so in a way, these works, Shenzhou's work is part of an album that he did for a wealthy patron that allowed that patron to symbolize his kind of his allegiance to certain intellectual ideals. The same thing is going on in the Italian Renaissance. I want to introduce an example of court painting so that we can really see here on the right we have court painting represented by Yin Hong, hundreds of birds amongst admiring the peacocks, and let's compare that to the literati example of Shenzhou's Poet on a Mountaintop. The work of Yin Hong, this is very typical of the court painting style. And if you want to practice some comparison, kind of get back into it, you can pause and jot down some comparisons in form, in content with both of these works. But I will continue, and I hope you thought of some of these ideas too. So one of the biggest differences here is that you see the use of polychrome, of color. This is a painting, a brightly colored painting done on silk. And we see all of these kind of beautiful, the different varieties of flowers and birds. This was a popular subject matter with that we see in previous generations, but it takes on a new meaning in the Ming Dynasty. This idea of these tiny birds throughout the composition here, above here, they're flittering around, admiring the peacocks who are kind of promenading through the composition. In a way, this is the same way that court officials, including those court painters, would have paid homage to the emperor and the imperial state. Very different than the kind of introspective, philosophical, and monochrome work that we see on the left. I want to be mindful of the time, so there might be a few works that we kind of skip ahead on, because I really want to focus on porcelain. I think porcelain, Chinese porcelain, is such a fascinating topic because, of course, today still we think about this blue and white glazed porcelain as something that is quintessentially Chinese. And in fact, during the Ming Dynasty, one of the most important art objects made were things out of porcelain. The Ming were famous all around the world in the 15th and 16th centuries for ceramic production. But the actual story is so much more complicated and fascinating because this archetypal Chinese aesthetic and art form came from Iran. How do we know that? The blue pigment that we see in Chinese porcelain is made out of cobalt, and cobalt is popular in Iranian pottery. And then Chinese travelers and merchants would have brought cobalt pottery to China on the Silk routes. And so they started to emulate this work. And in fact, early Chinese records, when they talk about this fantastic blue color, they call it Muslim blue to distinguish it as something that came from outside of Chinese territory. It comes from a Muslim territory. And here, this is really where we're thinking about that module objective about artistic transmission. So the question is, how and why was this market able to spread and become worldwide? So, going back, if we go back to the Yuans, they had connections to Central Asia. They established this big empire that brings a lot of peace and prosperity all along the Silk routes. And so we see blue and white porcelain beginning to travel kind of en masse along the Silk routes. The word porcelain is also really fascinating and also indicates to us the kind of international origins of porcelain. So Marco Polo talks about porcelain and he's fascinated by it. And he calls it in Italian porcellana, which just means little piglet, or it's also the word that's used to describe the inside of a conch shell. Think about that kind of mother of pearl um, appearance. And so the closest thing that he could figure out for how to describe porcelain to people who had never seen it was to describe it as porcellana. And so these objects that we think of as the most Chinese of all objects, blue and white porcelain, is actually, the name is Italian. The pigments originally came from Iran, and it is really much more indicative of this kind of transmission along the Silk Roads. What we're actually seeing here are two vessels used for decanting wine, and we have this dragon here as a negative and then a positive motif kind of flying around. The dragon is the symbol of the Emperor of China, and so something that we see in a lot of the iconography. Now the final work for the Ming Dynasty is the Forbidden City in Beijing, and here I've posted, don't worry about the website here, but I have embedded a short video about the Forbidden City, which is going to be much more interesting than me talking to you about it using static photos. So that ends the Ming Dynasty, and then the next video here will pick up with the Qing Dynasty.